An astrological experiment. As I have already said, we need two different facts, one of which represents the astrological constellation and the other the married state. The material to be examined, namely a quantity of marriage horoscopes, was obtained from friendly donors in Zurich, London, Rome, and Vienna. Originally, the material had been put together for purely astrological purposes, some of it many years ago, so that those who gathered the material knew of no connection between its collection and the aim of the present study, a fact which I stress because it might be objected that the material was specially selected with that aim in view. This was not so. The sample was a random one. The horoscopes, or rather the birth data, were piled up in chronological order just as the post brought them in. When the horoscopes of 180 married pairs had come in, there was a pause in the collection, during which the 360 horoscopes were worked out. This first batch was used to conduct a pilot investigation, as I wanted to test out the methods to be employed. Since the material had been collected originally, in order to test the empirical foundations of this intuitive method, a few more general remarks may not be out of place concerning the considerations which prompted the collection of the material. Marriage is a well-characterized fact, though its psychological aspect shows every conceivable sort of variation. According to the astrological view, it is precisely this aspect of marriage that expresses itself most markedly in the horoscopes. The possibility that the individuals characterized by the horoscopes married one another, so to say, by accident, will necessarily recede into the background. All external factors seem capable of astrological evaluation, but only inasmuch as they are represented psychologically. Owing to the very large number of characterological variations, we would hardly expect marriage to be characterized by only one astrological configuration. Rather, if astrological assumptions are at all correct, there will be several configurations that point to a predisposition in the choice of a marriage partner. In this connection, I must call the reader's attention to the well-known correspondence between the sunspot periods and the mortality curve. The connecting link appears to be the disturbances of the Earth's magnetic field, which in their turn are due to fluctuations in the proton radiation from the sun. These fluctuations also have an influence on radio weather by disturbing the ionosphere that reflects the radio waves. Investigation of these disturbances seems to indicate that the conjunctions, oppositions, and quartile aspects of the planets play a considerable part in increasing the proton radiation, and thus causing electromagnetic storms. On the other hand, the astrologically favorable trine and sextile aspects have been reported to produce uniform radio weather. These observations give us an unexpected glimpse into a possible causal basis for astrology. At all events, this is certainly true of Kepler's weather astrology. But it is also possible that, over and above the already established physiological effects of proton radiation, psychic effects can occur, which would rob astrological statements of their chance nature and bring them within range of a causal explanation. Although nobody knows what the validity of a nativity horoscope rests on, it is just conceivable that there is a causal connection between the planetary aspects and the psychophysiological disposition. One would therefore do well not to regard the results of astrological observation as synchronistic phenomena, but to take them as possibly causal in origin. For, wherever a cause is even remotely thinkable, synchronicity becomes an exceedingly doubtful proposition. For the present, at any rate, we have insufficient grounds for believing that the astrological results are more than mere chance, or that statistics involving large numbers yield a statistically significant result. As large-scale studies are lacking, I decided to investigate the empirical basis of astrology using a large number of horoscopes of married pairs just to see what kind of figures would turn up. Pilot investigation. With the first batch assembled, I turned first to the conjunctions and oppositions of Sun and Moon, two aspects regarded in astrology as being about equally strong, though in opposite senses, i.e., as signifying intensive relations between the heavenly bodies. Together with the Mars, Venus, ascending and descending conjunctions and oppositions, they yield 50 different aspects. The reasons why I chose these combinations will be clear to the reader from my remarks on the astrological traditions in the previous chapter. I have only to add here that of the conjunctions and oppositions, those of Mars and Venus are far less important than the rest, as will readily be appreciated from the following consideration. The relation of Mars to Venus can reveal a love relation, but a marriage is not always a love relation, and a love relation is not always a marriage. My aim in including the conjunction and opposition of Mars and Venus was therefore to compare them with the other conjunctions and oppositions. These 50 aspects were first studied for 180 married couples. It is clear that these 180 men and 180 women can also be paired off into unmarried couples. In fact, since any one of the 180 men could be paired off with any one of the 179 women to whom he was not married, it is clear that we can investigate 180 by 179 equals 32,220 unmarried pairs within the group of 180 marriages. This was done, and the aspect analysis for these unmarried pairs was compared with that for the married pairs. For all calculations, an orbit of 8 degrees either way was assumed clockwise and anti-clockwise, not only inside the sign, but extending beyond it. Later, 2 more batches of 220 and 83 marriages were added to the original batch, so that in all, 483 marriages, or 966 horoscopes, were examined. Evaluation of the batches showed that the most frequent aspect in the first was a Sun-Moon conjunction, 10%. In the second, a Moon-Moon conjunction, 10.9%. And in the third, a Moon-ascending conjunction, 9.6%. To begin with, what interested me most was, of course, the question of probability. Were the maximum results that we obtained significant figures or not? That is, were they improbable or not? Calculations undertaken by a mathematician showed unmistakably that the average frequency of 10% in all 3 batches is far from representing a significant figure. Its probability is much too great. In other words, there is no ground for assuming that our maximum frequencies are more than mere dispersions due to chance. Analysis of first batch. First, we counted all the conjunctions and oppositions between Sun, Moon, Mars, Venus, ascending and descending for the 180 married and the 32,220 unmarried pairs. The results are shown in Table 1, where it will be observed that the aspects are arranged by frequency of their occurrence in the married and unmarried pairs. Clearly, the frequencies of occurrence shown in columns 2 and 4 of Table 1 for observed occurrences of the aspects in married and unmarried pairs, respectively, are not immediately comparable, since the first are occurrences in 180 pairs and the second in 32,220 pairs. In column 5, therefore, we show the 180 figures in column 4 multiplied by the factor 180 over 32,220. Table 2 shows the ratios between the figures in columns 2 and 5 of Table 1 arranged according to frequency. E.g., the ratio for Moon-Sun conjunction is 18 divided by 8.4 equals 2.14. To a statistician, these figures cannot be used to confirm anything, and so are valueless, because they are chance dispersions. But on psychological grounds, I have discarded the idea that we are dealing with mere chance numbers. In a total picture of natural events, it is just as important to consider the exceptions to the rule as the averages. This is the fallacy of the statistical picture. It is one-sided, inasmuch as it represents only the average aspect of reality and excludes the total picture. The statistical view of the world is a mere abstraction and therefore incomplete and even fallacious, particularly so when it deals with man's psychology. Inasmuch as chance maxima and minima occur, they are facts whose nature I set out to explore. What strikes us in Table 2 is the unequal distribution of the frequency values. The top 7 and bottom 6 aspects both show a fairly strong dispersion, while the middle values tend to cluster round the ratio 1 by 1. I shall come back to this peculiar distribution with the help of a special graph, Figure 2. An interesting point is the confirmation of the traditional astrological and alchemical correspondence between marriage and the moon-sun aspects. Feminine-moon conjunction, masculine. Sun, 2.14 by 1, feminine-moon opposition, masculine sun, 1.61 by 1, whereas there is no evidence of any emphasis on the Venus-Mars aspects. Of the 50 possible aspects, the result shows that for the married pairs, there are 15 such configurations whose frequency is well above the proportion 1 to 1. The highest value is found in the aforementioned moon-sun conjunction, and the two next highest figures, 1.89 by 1 and 1.68 by 1, correspond to the conjunctions between feminine ascending and masculine Venus, or feminine moon and masculine ascending, thus apparently confirming the traditional significance of the ascendant. Of these 15 aspects, a moon aspect occurs 4 times for women, whereas only 6 moon aspects are distributed among the 35 other possible values. The mean proportional value of all moon aspects amounts to 1.24 to 1. The average value of the 4 just cited in the table amounts to 1.74 to 1, as compared with 1.24 to 1 for all moon aspects. The moon seems to be less emphasized for men than for women. For men, the corresponding role is played not by the sun, but by the ascending-descending axis. In the first 15 aspects of Table 2, these aspects occur 6 times for men and only twice for women. In the former case, they have an average value of 1.42 to 1, as compared with 1.22 to 1 for all masculine aspects between ascending or descending on the one hand and one of the 4 heavenly bodies on the other. Figures 2 and 3 give a graphic representation of the frequencies shown respectively in columns 2 and 5 of Table 1 from the point of view of the dispersion of aspects. This arrangement enables us not only to visualize the dispersion in the frequency of occurrence of the different aspects, but also to make a rapid estimate of the mean number of occurrences per aspect using the median as an estimator. Whereas in order to get the arithmetic mean, we have to total the aspect frequencies and divide by the number of aspects. The median frequency is found by counting down the histogram to a point where half the squares are counted and half are still to count. Since there are 50 squares in the histogram, the median is seen to be 8.0, since 25 squares do not exceed this value, and 25 squares do exceed it. Compare Figure 2. For the married pairs, the median amounts to 8 cases, but in the combinations of unmarried pairs, it is more, namely 8.4. Compare Figure 3. For the unmarried, the median coincides with the arithmetic mean. Both amount to 8.4, whereas the median for the married is lower than the corresponding mean value of 8.4, which is due to the presence of lower values for the married pairs. A glance at Figure 2 will show that there is a wide dispersion of values, which contrasts strikingly with those clustered round the mean figure of 8.4 in Figure 3. Here, there is not a single aspect with a frequency greater than 9.6, compare Figure 3, whereas among the married, one aspect reaches a frequency of nearly twice as much, namely 18, compare Figure 2. Comparison of all batches. On the supposition that the dispersion apparent in Figure 2 was due to chance, I investigated a larger number of marriage horoscopes by combining the first batch of 180 and the second batch of 220 married pairs, thus making 400 in all, or 800 individual horoscopes. The results are shown in Table 3, though I have confined myself here to the maximal figures that clearly exceed the median. Figures are given in percentages. The 180 couples in the first column represent the results of the first collection, while the 220 in the second column were collected more than a year later. The second column not only differs from the first in its aspects, but shows a marked sinking of the frequency values. The only exception is the top figure, representing the classical moon conjunction moon. It takes the place of the equally classical moon conjunction sun in the first column. Of the 14 aspects in the first column, only 4 come up again in the second. But of these, no less than 3 are moon aspects, and this is in accord with astrological expectations. The absence of correspondence between the aspects of the first and second columns indicates a great inequality of material, i.e., there is a wide dispersion. One can see this in the aggregate figures for the 400 married pairs. As a result of the evening out of the dispersion, they all show a marked decrease. This is brought out still more clearly in Table 4, where the third batch is added. This table shows the frequency figures for the 3 constellations that occur most often: 2 lunar conjunctions and 1 lunar opposition. The highest average frequency, that for the original 180 marriages, is 8.1%. For the 220 collected and worked out later, the average maximum drops to 7.7%. And for the 83 marriages that were added still later, the average amounts to only 5.6%. In the original batches of 180 and 220, the maxima still lie with the same aspects: moon conjunction sun, moon conjunction moon. But in the last batch of 83, it turned out that the maxima lay with different aspects, namely ascending conjunction moon, sun conjunction Venus, sun conjunction Mars, and ascending conjunction ascending. The average maximum for these 4 aspects is 8.7%. This high figure exceeds our highest average of 8.1% for the first batch of 180, which only proves how fortuitous our favorable initial results were. Nevertheless, it is worth pointing out that, amusingly enough, in the last batch, the maximum of 9.6% lies, as we said earlier, with the ascending conjunction moon aspect. That is, with another lunar aspect, which is supposed to be particularly characteristic of marriage. A lusus naturae, no doubt, but a very queer one, since according to tradition, the ascendant or horoscopus, together with sun and moon, forms the trinity that determines fate and character. Had one wanted to falsify the statistical findings so as to bring them into line with tradition, one could not have done it more successfully. Table 5 gives the maximal frequencies for unmarried pairs. The first result was obtained by my co-worker, Dr. Liliane Freiron, putting the men's horoscopes on one side and the women's on the other, and then combining each of the pairs that happened to lie on top. Care was naturally taken that a real married pair was not accidentally combined. The resultant frequency of 7.3 is pretty high in comparison with the much more probable maximal figure for the 32,220 unmarried pairs, which is only 5.3. This first result seemed to me somewhat suspicious. I therefore suggested that we should not combine the pairs ourselves, but should proceed in the following way. 325 men's horoscopes were numbered. The numbers were written on separate slips, thrown into a pot, and mixed up. Then a person who knew nothing of astrology and psychology, and even less of these investigations, was invited to draw the slips one by one out of the pot, without looking at them. The numbers were each combined with the topmost on the pile of women's horoscopes, care being again taken that married pairs did not accidentally come together. In this way, 3 and 25 artificial pairs were obtained, the resultant 6.5 is rather nearer to probability. Still more probable is the result obtained for the 400 unmarried pairs. Even so, this figure, 6.2, is still too high. The somewhat curious behavior of our figures led to a further experiment, whose results I mention here with all the necessary reserve, though it seems to me to throw some light on the statistical variations. It was made with 3 people whose psychological status was accurately known. The experiment consisted in taking 400 marriage horoscopes at random and providing 200 of them with numbers. 20 of these were then drawn by lot by the subject. These 20 married pairs were examined statistically for our 50 marriage characteristics. The first subject was a woman patient who, at the time of the experiment, found herself in a state of intense emotional excitement. It proved that of 20 Mars aspects, no less than 10 were emphasized, with a frequency of 15.0. Of the Moon aspects, 9, with a frequency of 10.0. And of the Sun aspects, 9, with a frequency of 14.0. The classical significance of Mars lies in his emotionality, in this case supported by the masculine Sun. As compared with our general results, there is a predominance of the Mars aspects, which fully agrees with the psychic state of the subject. The second subject was a woman patient whose main problem was to realize and assert her personality in the face of her self-suppressive tendencies. In this case, the axial aspects, ascending, descending, which are supposed to be characteristic of the personality, came up 12 times with a frequency of 20.0, and the Moon aspects with a frequency of 18.0. This result, astrologically considered, was in full agreement with the subject's actual problems. The third subject was a woman with strong inner oppositions, whose union and reconciliation constituted her main problem. The Moon aspects came up 14 times with a frequency of 20.0, the Sun aspects 12 times with a frequency of 15.0, and the axial aspects 9 times with a frequency of 14.0. The classical conjunctio soils et lunae as the symbol of the union of opposites is clearly emphasized. In all these cases, the selection by lot of marriage horoscopes proves to have been influenced, and this fits in with our experience of the I Ching and other mantic procedures. Although all these figures lie well within the limits of probability and cannot therefore be regarded as anything more than chance, their variation, which each time corresponds surprisingly well with the psychic state of the subject, still gives one food for thought. The psychic state was characterized as a situation in which insight and decision come up against the insurmountable barrier of an unconscious opposed to the will. This relative defeat of the powers of the conscious mind constellates the moderating archetype, which appears in the first case as Mars, the emotional maleficus, in the second case as the equilibrating axial system that strengthens the personality, and in the third case as the hieros gamos, or conjunctio of supreme opposites. The psychic and physical event, namely the subject's problems and choice of horoscope, correspond, it would seem, to the nature of the archetype in the background, and could therefore represent a synchronistic phenomenon. Inasmuch as I am not very well up in the higher mathematics, and had therefore to rely on the help of a professional, I asked Professor Marcus Fierz of Basel to calculate the probability of my maximal figures. This he very kindly did, and using the Poisson distribution, he arrived at a probability of 1 in 10,000 for the first 2 maxima, and of 1 in 1,300 for the third. Later, on checking the calculation, he found an error whose correction raised the probability of the first 2 maxima to 1 in 1,500. A further check proved the probabilities of the 3 maxima to be, respectively, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, 1 in 50. From this it is clear that although our best results Moon conjunction Sun and Moon conjunction Moon, are fairly improbable in practice. They are theoretically so probable that there is little justification for regarding the immediate results of our statistics as anything more than chance. If, for instance, there is a 1 in 1,000 probability of my getting the telephone connection I want, I shall probably prefer, instead of waiting on the off chance for a telephone conversation, to write a letter. Our investigation shows that not only do the frequency values approximate to the average with the greatest number of married pairs, but that any chance pairings produce similar statistical proportions. From the scientific point of view, the result of our investigation is in some respects not encouraging for astrology, as everything seems to indicate that in the case of large numbers, the differences between the frequency values for the marriage aspects of married and unmarried pairs disappear altogether. Thus, from the scientific point of view, there is little hope of proving that astrological correspondence is something that conforms to law. At the same time, it is not so easy to counter the astrologer's objection that my statistical method is too arbitrary and too clumsy to evaluate correctly the numerous psychological and astrological aspects of marriage. So the essential thing that remains over from our astrological statistics is the fact that the first batch of 180 marriage horoscopes shows a distinct maximum of 18 for Moon conjunction Sun, and the second batch of 220 a maximum of 24 for Moon conjunction Moon. These two aspects have long been mentioned in the old literature as marriage characteristics, and they therefore represent the oldest tradition. The third batch of 83 yields a maximum of 8 for Moon conjunction ascending. These maxima, as we have said, have probabilities of about 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, and 1 in 50 respectively. I should like to illustrate what has happened here by means of an example. You take 3 matchboxes, put 1,000 black ants in the first, 10,000 in the second, and 50 in the third, together with 1 white ant in each. Shut the boxes and bore a hole in each of them, small enough to allow only 1 ant to crawl through at a time. The first ant to come out of each of the 3 boxes is always the white one. The chances of this actually happening are extremely improbable. Even in the first 2 cases, the probability works out at 1 in 1,000 by 10,000, which means that such a coincidence is to be expected only in 1 case out of 10 million. It is improbable that it would ever happen in anyone's experience. Yet in my statistical investigation, it happened that precisely the 3 conjunctions stressed by astrological tradition came together in the most improbable way. For the sake of accuracy, however, it should be pointed out that it is not the same white ant that is the first to appear each time. That is to say, although there is always a lunar conjunction and always a classical one of decisive significance, they are nevertheless different conjunctions, because each time the moon is associated with a different partner. These are, of course, the 3 main components of the horoscope, namely the ascendant, or rising degree of a zodiacal sign, which characterizes the moment, the moon, which characterizes the day, and the sun, which characterizes the month of birth. Hence, if we consider only the first 2 batches, we must assume 2 white ants for each box. This correction raises the probability of the coinciding lunar conjunctions to 1 in 2,500,000. If we take the 3rd batch as well, the coincidence of the 3 classical moon aspects has a probability of 1 in 62,500,000. The first proportion is significant even when taken by itself, for it shows that the coincidence is a very improbable one. But the coincidence with the 3rd lunar conjunction is so remarkable that it looks like a deliberate arrangement in favor of astrology. If, therefore, the result of our experiment should be found to have a significant, i.e., more than merely chance probability. The case for astrology would be proved in the most satisfactory way. If, on the contrary, the figures actually fall within the limits of chance expectation, they do not support the astrological claim. They merely imitate accidentally the ideal answer to astrological expectation. It is nothing but a chance result from the statistical point of view, yet it is meaningful on account of the fact that it looks as if it validated this expectation. It is just what I call a synchronistic phenomenon. The statistically significant statement only concerns regularly occurring events, and if considered as axiomatic, it simply abolishes all exceptions to the rule. It produces a merely average picture of natural events, but not a true picture of the world as it is. Yet the exceptions, and my results are exceptions, and most improbable ones at that, are just as important as the rules. Statistics would not even make sense without the exceptions. There is no rule that is true under all circumstances, for this is the real and not a statistical world. Because the statistical method shows only the average aspects, it creates an artificial and predominantly conceptual picture of reality. That is why we need a complementary principle for a complete description and explanation of nature. If we now consider the results of Rhine's experiments, and particularly the fact that they depend in large measure on the subject's active interest, we can regard what happened in our case as a synchronistic phenomenon. The statistical material shows that a practically as well as theoretically improbable chance combination occurred, which coincides in the most remarkable way with traditional astrological expectations. That such a coincidence should occur at all is so improbable and so incredible that nobody could have dared to predict anything like it. It really does look as if the statistical material had been manipulated and arranged so as to give the appearance of a positive result. The necessary emotional and archetypal conditions for a synchronistic phenomenon were already given, since it is obvious that both my co-worker and myself had a lively interest in the outcome of the experiment. And apart from that, the question of synchronicity had been engaging my attention for many years. What seems, in fact, to have happened, and seems often to have happened, bearing in mind the long astrological tradition, is that we got a result which has presumably turned up many times before in history. Had the astrologers, with but few exceptions, concerned themselves more with statistics and questioned the justice of their interpretations in a scientific spirit, they would have discovered long ago that their statements rested on a precarious foundation. But I imagine that in their case too, as with me, a secret, mutual connivance existed between the material and the psychic state of the astrologer. This correspondence is simply there like any other agreeable or annoying accident, and it seems doubtful to me whether it can be proved scientifically to be anything more than that. One may be fooled by coincidence, but one has to have a very thick skin not to be impressed by the fact that out of 50 possibilities, 3 times precisely those turned up as maxima, which are regarded by tradition as typical. As though to make this startling result even more impressive, we found that use had been made of unconscious deception. On first working out the statistics, I was put off the trail by a number of errors which I fortunately discovered in time. After overcoming this difficulty, I then forgot to mention in the Swiss edition of this book that the ant comparison, if applied to our experiment, only fits if respectively 2 or 3 white ants are assumed each time. This considerably reduces the improbability of our results. Then, at the 11th hour, Professor Fiers, on checking his probability calculations yet again, found that he had been deceived by the factor 5. The improbability of our results was again reduced, though without reaching a degree which one could have described as probable. The errors all tend to exaggerate the results in a way favorable to astrology, and add most suspiciously to the impression of an artificial or fraudulent arrangement of the facts, which was so mortifying to those concerned that they would probably have preferred to keep silent about it. I know, however, from long experience of these things, that spontaneous synchronistic phenomena draw the observer, by hook or by crook, into what is happening, and occasionally make him an accessory to the deed. That is the danger inherent in all parapsychological experiments. The dependence of ESP on an emotional factor in the experimenter and subject is a case in point. I therefore consider it a scientific duty to give as complete an account as possible of the result, and to show how not only the statistical material, but the psychic processes of the interested parties were affected by the synchronistic arrangement. Although, warned by previous experience, I was cautious enough to submit my original account in the Swiss edition to 4 competent persons, among them 2 mathematicians. I allowed myself to be lulled into a sense of security too soon. The corrections made here do not in any way alter the fact that the maximal frequencies lie with the 3 classical lunar aspects. In order to assure myself of the chance nature of the result, I undertook one more statistical experiment. I broke up the original and fortuitous chronological order and the equally fortuitous division into 3 batches by mixing the first 150 marriages with the last 150. Taking the latter in reverse order. That is to say, I put the first marriage on top of the last, and then the second on top of the last but one, and so on. Then I divided the 300 marriages into 3 batches of 100. The result was as follows. Maximum. First batch, no aspects, 11%. Second batch, Sun conjunction Mars, 11%. Moon conjunction Moon, 11%. Third batch, Moon conjunction ascending, 12%. The result of the first batch is amusing insofar as only 15 of the 300 marriages have none of the 50 selected aspects in common. The second batch yields 2 maxima, of which the second again represents a classical conjunction. The third batch yields a maximum for Moon conjunction ascending, which we already know as the third classical conjunction. The total result shows that another chance arrangement of the marriages can easily produce a result that deviates from the earlier total, but still does not quite prevent the classical conjunctions from turning up. The result of our experiment tallies with our experience of mantic procedures. One has the impression that these methods, and others like them, create favorable conditions for the occurrence of meaningful coincidences. It is quite true that the verification of synchronistic phenomena is a difficult and sometimes impossible task. Rhine's achievement in demonstrating, with the help of unexceptionable material, the coincidence of a psychic state with a corresponding objective process must therefore be rated all the higher, despite the fact that the statistical method is in general highly unsuited to do justice to unusual events. Rhine's experiments have nevertheless withstood the ruinous influence of statistics. Their results must therefore be taken into account in any assessment of synchronistic phenomena. In view of the leveling influence which the statistical method has on the quantitative determination of synchronicity, we must ask how it was that Rhine succeeded in obtaining positive results. I maintain that he would never have got the results he did if he had carried out his experiments with a single subject or only a few. He needed a constant renewal of interest, an emotion with its characteristic abasement mental, which tips the scales in favor of the unconscious. Only in this way can space and time be relativized to a certain extent, thereby reducing the chances of a causal process. What then happens is a kind of creatio ex nihilo, an act of creation that is not causally explicable. The mantic procedures owe their effectiveness to this same connection with emotionality. By touching an unconscious aptitude, they stimulate interest, curiosity, expectation, hope, and fear, and consequently evoke a corresponding preponderance of the unconscious. The effective, numinous agents in the unconscious are the archetypes. By far, the greatest number of spontaneous synchronistic phenomena that I have had occasion to observe and analyze can easily be shown to have a direct connection with an archetype. This in itself is an irrepresentable psychoid factor of the collective unconscious. The latter cannot be localized, since either it is complete in principle in every individual or is found to be the same everywhere. You can never say with certainty whether what appears to be going on in the collective unconscious of a single individual is not also happening in other individuals, or organisms, or things, or situations. When, for instance, the vision arose in Swedenborg's mind of a fire in Stockholm, there was a real fire raging there at the same time, without there being any demonstrable or even thinkable connection between the two. I certainly would not like to undertake to prove the archetypal connection in this case. I would only point to the fact that in Swedenborg's biography, there are certain things which throw a remarkable light on his psychic state. We must assume that there was a lowering of the threshold of consciousness which gave him access to absolute knowledge. The fire in Stockholm was, in a sense, burning in him too. For the unconscious psyche, space and time seem to be relative. That is to say, knowledge finds itself in a space-time continuum in which space is no longer space nor time-time. If, therefore, the unconscious should develop or maintain a potential in the direction of consciousness, it is then possible for parallel events to be perceived or known. Compared with Rhine's work, the great disadvantage of my astrological statistics lies in the fact that the entire experiment was carried out on only one subject, myself. I did not experiment with a variety of subjects. Rather, it was the varied material that challenged my interest. I was thus in the position of a subject who is at first enthusiastic, but afterwards cools off on becoming habituated to the ESP experiment. The results, therefore, deteriorated with the growing number of experiments, which in this case corresponded to the exposition of the material in batches, so that the accumulation of larger numbers only blurred the favorable initial result. Equally, my final experiment showed that the discarding of the original order and the division of the horoscopes into arbitrary batches produce, as might be expected, a different picture, though its significance is not altogether clear. Rhine's rules are to be recommended wherever, as in medicine, very large numbers are not involved. The interest and expectancy of the investigator might well be accompanied synchronistically by surprisingly favorable results to begin with, despite every precaution. These will be interpreted as miracles only by persons insufficiently acquainted with the statistical character of natural law. If, and it seems plausible, the meaningful coincidence or cross-connection of events cannot be explained causally, then the connecting principle must lie in the equal significance of parallel events. In other words, their tertium comparationis is meaning. We are so accustomed to regard meaning as a psychic process or content that it never enters our heads to suppose that it could also exist outside the psyche. But we do know at least enough about the psyche not to attribute to it any magical power, and still less can we attribute any magical power to the conscious mind. If, therefore, we entertain the hypothesis that one and the same transcendental meaning might manifest itself simultaneously in the human psyche, and in the arrangement of an external and independent event, we at once come into conflict with the conventional scientific and epistemological views. We have to remind ourselves over and over again of the merely statistical validity of natural laws, and of the effect of the statistical method in eliminating all unusual occurrences, if we want to lend an ear to such an hypothesis. The great difficulty is that we have absolutely no scientific means of proving the existence of an objective meaning, which is not just a psychic product. We are, however, driven to some such assumption if we are not to regress to a magical causality and ascribe to the psyche a power that far exceeds its empirical range of action. In that case, we should have to suppose, if we don't want to let causality go, either that Swedenborg's unconscious staged the Stockholm fire, or conversely, that the objective event activated in some quite inconceivable manner the corresponding images in Swedenborg's brain. In either case, we come up against the unanswerable question of transmission discussed earlier. It is, of course, entirely a matter of subjective opinion which hypothesis is felt to make more sense. Nor does tradition help us much in choosing between magical causality and transcendental meaning, because on the one hand, the primitive mentality has always explained synchronicity as magical causality right down to our own day, and on the other hand, philosophy assumed a secret correspondence or meaningful connection between natural events until well into the 18th century. I prefer the latter hypothesis because it does not, like the first, conflict with the empirical concept of causality and can count as a principle sui generis. That obliges us not indeed to correct the principles of natural explanation as hitherto understood, but at least to add to their number, an operation which only the most cogent reasons could justify. I believe, however, that the hints I have given in the foregoing constitute an argument that needs thorough consideration. Psychology of all the sciences cannot in the long run afford to overlook such experiences. These things are too important for an understanding of the unconscious, quite apart from their philosophical implications.